He sat at the defense table with his chin slightly raised, not forward, not down, up, like the room was beneath him, like he'd already done the math, and like the answer, on his face, a smirk, not nerves, not grief, a smirk. He'd heard the word juvenile. 3 miles away, in a parking lot near Tropicana Field, a police officer had reached for a notepad, not a weapon, a notepad. He never got to open it. 5 shots, close range. Not one missed, not one. This is a trial of Nicholas Lindsey, Jr., St. Petersburg, Florida, February 2011. 1 officer dead. 1 16-year-old boy, chin raised, smirking at a courtroom that was about to play the evidence. He thought he knew how this ended. The prosecution was about to show him exactly how wrong he was. Before we go any further, everything you are about to hear is documented. Court records, police reports, autopsy findings, ballistic analysis, all of it confirmed, all of it consistent, none of it disputed. This story comes from the First District Court of Appeal, Florida, Pinellas County trial documents, resentencing hearing transcripts from 2013, and again from 2017. St. Petersburg Police Department case records, school testimony on record from his principal, from his teacher, public statements from Mayor Bill Foster of St. Petersburg, and Supreme Court precedent, Miller v. Alabama, applied directly to this case. We are not speculating. We are not reconstructing. We are reading what the courts wrote, what the witnesses said, what the evidence proved. Now, the facts. St. Petersburg, Florida, February 21st, 2011. Officer David Crawford, 4 to 6 years old, on patrol, responding to a call. Suspicious person, near Tropicana Field. Nicholas Lindsey, Jr., 16 years old, on foot. They had never met. No history, no connection, no reason their paths should have crossed that night. They were strangers. By 10:37 p.m., they would not be strangers anymore. Now, before we go to the evidence, you need to hear what the defense said, because they weren't wrong. Not entirely. Not on paper. Nicholas Lindsey was 16 years old. His IQ, court-tested, court-ordered, fell between 77 and 86. Borderline range. The defense stood up and said what the science supported. His brain wasn't finished. Not metaphorically. Literally, the part of the human brain responsible for impulse control, for weighing consequence, for understanding what forever means. It doesn't finish developing until the mid-20s. That's not an argument. That's neuroscience. And the Supreme Court agreed with him. Miller v. Alabama, a landmark ruling that said juvenile offenders cannot be sentenced the same way as adults, because they are not the same as adults. The defense had the highest court in the country on their side. Then they pointed to the school record. His principal took the stand. His teacher took the stand. And what they described was not the person the prosecution was painting. Compliant, calm, responsive to authority, unremarkable, a student who did not stand out, not for violence, not for aggression, not for anything. The defense looked at the jury and said, "This is not who he is." And then, the confession. The defense went after it hard. They argued it was coerced. That inside that interrogation room, with a camera running, his own parents told him to talk, told him that if he admitted what happened, leniency was coming, that the system would go easy on him. A 16-year-old boy, borderline IQ, his parents on either side of him, detectives across the table, and someone in that room telling him, "Talk." The defense had built something real. A story about a child, about a brain that wasn't ready, about a confession that might not have been free. It was a human story, and for a moment, it almost held together. Then the prosecutor stood up and started asking about the shots. Go back to that parking lot. 10:37 p.m. Near Tropicana Field. Sodium lights overhead. Quiet between events. The kind of quiet that makes small sounds loud. Officer David Crawford had responded to a call. Suspicious person. Routine. The kind of call that ends with conversation and a note. He reached for something. Not his weapon. Not his radio. A notepad. A man, 4 to 6 years old, reaching for paper. He never opened it. 5 shots. 5. Fired at close range. Each one directed. Not scattered. Directed. At vital areas of the human body. Not one missed. Let that settle for a moment. Not one. The defense had just spent 2 days telling the jury about an impulsive teenager. A boy with an unfinished brain. A child who couldn't weigh consequences. Who acted without thinking. Who didn't understand what forever meant. The prosecutor let them finish. Then stood up and pointed at the body diagram. 5 marks. 5 hits. No scatter. No wide shots pulled by panic. No rounds that grazed. No evidence of a hand shaking. Panic doesn't do that. Fear doesn't do that. You know what produces 5 shots. Close range. 0 misses. All directed at vital areas. A decision. The defense pushed back. Of course they did. They argued the prosecution was retrofitting intent onto a chaotic moment. That a teenager in a dark parking lot, cornered and frightened, could produce that result by instinct, by accident, by the terrible mathematics of proximity and panic. The prosecution's response was quiet, almost simple. You don't argue with a body diagram. 5 marks, 5 hits, no scatter, no hesitation. This wasn't a struggle that escalated. This wasn't confusion in the dark. This was a sequence. And sequences have intent. Officer Donald J. Ziegler was the first to respond. He heard what he later described as an exchange of gunfire. He moved toward the sound, toward Crawford's location, and he found him, near his cruiser, not inside it, not moving toward it, near it. That one word, near, tells you everything about how fast it happened. Crawford never made it back. He went down where he stood, 4 to 6 years old, a notepad he never opened, 5 shots he never heard coming. The defense had argued this was a child who couldn't appreciate consequences, but the prosecution stood in front of that jury and said something the body diagram had already said louder than any words could. He didn't miss. Not once. Not even close. Here's where it gets complicated, because the prosecution had a problem, and they knew it. His principal sat on that stand and did not describe a dangerous kid. His teacher sat on that stand and did not describe a dangerous kid. What they described was this: compliant, typical, responsive to authority. Those are not the words you use for someone. The prosecution is calling a premeditated killer. The prosecution knew that. They weren't going to pretend those words hadn't been said. They weren't going to fight the school record. Instead, they went further back. Court records, escalating conduct, starting around age 11, grand theft, trespassing, not the offense. Nobody was pretending they were. But the prosecution wasn't arguing about what those offenses were. They were arguing about what they pointed to. February 21st, 2011, the prosecution told that jury, was not an aberration. It was a destination, a point on a line that had been drawing itself 4 or 5 years before Officer Crawford ever got that call. 2 portraits, same person, neither one complete. And then, the mayor, in 2010, a full year before the shooting, Mayor Bill Foster of St. Petersburg attended a community outreach event. He met a lot of people that day, shook a lot of hands. One of them belonged to a 15-year-old boy who told the mayor he wanted to succeed. The mayor believed him. Why wouldn't he? A year later, that same mayor stood at a podium in front of cameras and called publicly for that same teenager to be tried as an adult. 1 man, 2 moments, a year apart. The boy he'd invested hope in became the person he wanted prosecuted. To the fullest extent of adult law, that is not irony. That is a case study in how fast a trajectory can turn, in how little time it takes for the person you believed in, to become the person you don't recognize. After the shooting, the city moved, more than 200 officers deployed, multiple agencies, through the night of February 21st, into the morning of February 22nd, searching, block by block, the largest manhunt St. Petersburg had seen in years, for one person, one 16-year-old. And when they finally found him, a full day later, hiding at a residence that was raided, it wasn't pure investigative work that led them there. It was phone calls, tips from the community, neighbors, residents, people who recognize him, people who may have known his name. Before any of this happened, the community that watched him grow up made the calls that put the handcuffs on him. 2 portraits. The school that called him compliant. The community that turned him in. Same kid, same streets, same city. And somewhere between the teenager who told a mayor he wanted to succeed and the parking lot near Tropicana Field, something had already been decided. The prosecution just had to prove it hadn't been decided in a single moment of panic. They were about to forget the courtroom for a moment, go back further, before the trial, before the charges were read, before the smirk. There was a room, not large, not comfortable, the kind of room designed to make you feel exactly how small you are. A camera in the corner, running, recording everything. The kind of camera that doesn't blink, doesn't look away, doesn't forget. Nicholas Lindsey sat inside it, 16 years old, IQ between 77 and 86. A boy who, according to his own school, was compliant, responsive to authority, and seated beside him, his parents, not detectives, not a lawyer, his parents, the only people in that building who were supposed to be on his side, the only people in that room he had any reason to trust. He didn't talk at first, just sat there, a 16-year-old boy, in a room designed for adults, facing something. His brain, by the defense's own argument, wasn't equipped to fully understand. Then his parents spoke to him, and then he talked. He told them everything, on camera, in that room, with his parents beside him, and detectives across the table, and a recording device, capturing every word. The defense would spend years pulling at that thread. They argued, formally, on the record, that what his parents said in that room was simple. Confess, and leniency follows. Talk, and the system goes easy on you. Tell them what happened, and this gets better. A 16-year-old boy, borderline cognitive range, his parents telling him to talk. The court heard that argument, reviewed the recording, evaluated the testimony, and rejected it, ruled the confession voluntary, ruled it admissible. But here's what the court could not do, no matter how it ruled. It could not UN film it. That camera recorded what it recorded. Whatever was said, however it was said, whatever a frightened 16-year-old, with a borderline IQ, understood or didn't understand, about what agreeing to talk would cost him. It's all in that room, and the full transcript, to this day, is not publicly available, which means you cannot read exactly what was said in that room. Neither can I. What we know, what the record confirms, is only what came out of it. A confession, on camera, voluntary, according to the court, coerced, according to the defense, and heard, in full, by a jury that had already seen the body diagram, with 5 marks on it. By the time that confession played in that courtroom, the case was no longer about whether he did it. It was about something the court would spend the next decade still arguing about. What does a 16-year-old boy actually understand about forever when his parents are the ones telling him to speak? Think about what a parent is. In a room like that, every other person in that building is working against your child. That is not cynicism. That is a structure of the system. Detectives build cases. Prosecutors file charges. The institution has already decided what it wants from that room. A parent is supposed to be the one person who wants something different. They came in as his protection. That was the role. That was the only reason they were allowed to be there at all. And they were present. The record confirms it. They spoke to him. The record confirms that too. And after they spoke to him, he confessed. That sequence, present, spoke, confessed, is not disputed by anyone, not the prosecution, not the defense, not the court. What is disputed, what has always been disputed, is what was said in the space between spoke and confessed. The defense argued it plainly. His parents told him leniency was coming, that the system would soften if he just told the truth. That talking was the way out, or at least the way to something easier. The prosecution argued the opposite. The confession was free, informed, given without condition. The court sided with the prosecution, but courts rule on legal standards. They answer specific questions with specific language, inside specific frameworks. What the court's ruling does not, cannot, answer is the quieter question, the one that sits underneath the legal conclusion and doesn't go away. Did Nicholas Lindsey, 16 years old, IQ between 77 and 86, sitting in a room built for adults, with detectives across the table, and his parents beside him, did he understand what he was agreeing to? Not legally, not technically, actually, did he understand that the words coming out of his mouth in that room were going to follow him for the rest of his life? That forever, the word his defense team would later argue, his brain wasn't equipped to process, was already being written. The moment he started talking, the record doesn't answer that. No ruling answers that. What the record shows is only the sequence. A boy, his parents, a camera, a confession, and a trial that was effectively decided before it ever started. Not in a courtroom, not during closing arguments, not when the jury filed back in. In that room, whatever passed between a 16-year-old boy and the two people he had every reason to trust. That was the moment. Everything that came after, the trial, the verdict, the sentencing, was just the court catching up to what that camera had already recorded. Go back to that courtroom, back to that face, the smirk. The defense had spent days building a portrait of a child who didn't understand consequences, who couldn't weigh outcomes, whose brain, by the science they cited, wasn't capable of fully appreciating what forever looked like. And there he sat today, chin raised, smirking. The prosecution didn't need to comment on it. The jury had eyes. But the smirk wasn't the only behavioral element the prosecution was working with. They had the school record, calm, compliant, unremarkable, and they had the parking lot. The prosecution stood in front of that jury and drew a line between those two things, because calm, real calm, the kind that doesn't shake, the kind that doesn't scatter its shots, the kind that doesn't miss once, at close range, that kind of calm is not innocence. That is what calm looks like when it is applied to something deliberate. The school saw compliance. The body diagram showed what that same stillness looked like at 10:37 p.m. in a parking lot near Tropicana Field. Same person, same capacity for calm, different context. The jury heard it. The verdict confirmed they understood it. And then the trial ended, and the behavior didn't. 2013, resentencing hearing. Judge Covert opened the file. The defense came back with Miller versus Alabama, came back with juvenile brain science, came back with the argument that a child who commits an offense is not the same as the adult that child becomes. The judge reviewed the prison conduct record, ongoing violent behavior, in custody, after the trial, after the conviction, after the sentencing. Still, life reimposed. 2017, another hearing. Same defense, same science, same argument about who he was versus who he had become. The judge reviewed the record again. Ongoing violent behavior. Still, life reimposed. Again, the boy the school called compliant became a man the prison system called dangerous. And the court, twice, looked at that record and said the same thing both times. Not yet. Not now. The defense had brought in an expert, Dr. Carpenter, testimony on rehabilitation, on the capacity for change, on the science that says the juvenile brain, even after the worst decisions it makes, is not permanently fixed, that people grow, that people change, that the person who commits an offense at 16 is not always the person who sits in a cell at 30. The court considered it and gave it limited weight. 2 words in a written opinion. Limited weight. Not dismissed, not ignored. Limited. Against a man's future. 2 words delivered in a legal document. Nobody outside that courtroom will ever have to live inside. The smirk in that courtroom belonged to a teenager who thought the word juvenile was going to save him. The prison conduct reports belonged to someone else entirely. Oh, the prosecution would argue exactly the same person, seen clearly, finally, at last, but before the verdict, before the sentencing, before any of this reached the courtroom, there was a funeral. 10,000 people. Sit with that number for a moment. 10,000 people filing into a service for a man who had been reaching for a notepad. Officers in dress uniform, row after row, televised locally, a city that had stopped to say goodbye to one of its own, except this wasn't the first time. Officer Crawford was the 3rd St. Petersburg officer, killed in 30 days. 30 days. 3 funerals. This city had already buried 2 officers before it buried David Crawford. It was not encountering grief, it was drowning in it. And somewhere in that grief, somewhere in those 10,000 faces, was the weight that would eventually walk into a jury room and not stay very long. When 10,000 people show up to say goodbye, that is not just mourning. That is a city telling a courtroom what this meant. And that was the weight the defense was asking the jury to balance against the age of a 16-year-old. That was always going to be impossible. The jury didn't deliberate long. They had the shots, 5 of them, close range, 0 misses. They had the ballistics, the trajectory analysis, the autopsy. They had the confession, on camera, in a room, from his own mouth. Forensically, this was never a contested case. It was never going to be. The defense had argued youth, brain development, cognitive capacity, coercion. The evidence had argued back, in a language that needed no interpretation. The jury came back. Count 1, first-degree murder. Guilty. Count 2, attempted first-degree murder. Guilty. The smirk, the one that had sat on his face at the start of this trial, like he'd already done the math, was gone. It had been gone for a while by then. Sentencing came before Judge Covert. This was post-Miller v. Alabama territory. The law was clear. A juvenile offender cannot simply be handed life and shown the door. The court is required to consider the individual, not just the offense, the person, his youth, his background, his cognitive profile, his capacity for rehabilitation, his potential to become someone different than the person who stood in that parking lot. Judge Covert considered all of it: the school record, the IQ testing, the expert testimony, the brain science, the Supreme Court precedent the defense had built its entire case around, considered it, weighed it, and said, life, not because the law demanded it automatically, because the judge, having considered everything, concluded it was just. The defense came back in 2013. Miller versus Alabama hadn't closed the door permanently. That was the whole point of the ruling. The door had to stay open. The law said so. Judge Covert opened the file, reviewed the prison conduct record, ongoing violent behavior, in custody, years after the trial, closed the file, life reimposed. Not yet. The record doesn't support it. The defense came back again. Same argument, same science, same door the law said couldn't be permanently shut. Judge Covert opened the file, read the conduct reports, ongoing violent behavior. Still, close the file, Life reimposed. Again. Not yet. Not now. 3 times. A court looked at Nicholas Lindsey and said the same thing. The boy who sat at that defense table, with his chin raised and a smirk on his face, and the word juvenile running through his head, like a key that was going to open a door. That boy had been wrong. The door the law kept open had a condition attached to it. Change. Demonstrable. Documented. Real. And 3 times. A judge looked at the record and found something else instead. Here is what happened. All of it. In sequence. A 16-year-old stole a car. A police officer responded to a call near where that car was. The officer reached for a notepad. 5 shots were fired. None missed. The shooter fled. 200 officers deployed through the night. A city held its breath. A community made phone calls. He was found. He was put in a room with his parents and a camera and detectives and a choice. He did not fully understand. He was making. He confessed. On camera, in his own voice, before he knew what capturing meant. That camera didn't lie. The autopsy didn't lie. The ballistics didn't lie. The body diagram, 5 marks, 5 hits, no scatter, didn't lie. And the jury, after hearing all of it, didn't need long. The prosecution hadn't needed much. The evidence had done most of the work before the first witness ever took the stand. 5 shots, 0 misses, close range, vital areas, and a confession on tape from the defendant's own mouth, his own words, in his own voice, captured in a room, before he understood what forever actually weighed. That was the case. Not complicated, not forensically uncertain, not a question of who, only ever a question of what kind of who. Child or choice. The jury answered that question. The judge answered it 3 times. And the answer has not changed. Nicholas Lindsey is currently incarcerated at DeSoto Annex, Arcadia, Florida. Flatland, rural, quiet in the way that has nothing to do with peace. He has been incarcerated since he was 16 years old. In 2036, marked on a court calendar, somewhere in a Florida courthouse. Right now, a judge will open a file. Nicholas Lindsey will be 41. Officer Crawford's daughter, Amanda, will be in her 50s, and the judge will ask the only question that has ever mattered in cases like this one: has this man changed enough to go free? Nobody knows the answer. Not the lawyers, not the judge, not Lindsey, not us. The smirk in that courtroom, the one that sat on the face of a 16-year-old who thought the word juvenile was a key, disappeared when the evidence played. He thought he knew how the story ended. He didn't. And in 2036, neither will we. The evidence doesn't age. The sentence doesn't forget. And a notepad, a man, simply reaching for a notepad, became the last thing Officer David Crawford ever reached for. That's the case. That's the record. That's what the court decided. If this story made you think, if it made you feel something you're still sitting with, don't let it disappear. When this video ends, hit the like button, not for the algorithm, because you stayed, because you watched a complicated case, all the way to its complicated ending, and you didn't look away. Subscribe to this channel, because this is what we do here. No hysteria, no speculation, just the record, the evidence, the courtroom, and the questions, the verdicts. Never fully answer. Share this video with someone who thinks true crime is just entertainment. Show them what it actually is when it's done right. A comment below. We want to know where you land. Was this justice? Was this a child? The system failed before it punished him? Or both? Because the most honest answer, the one the record keeps pointing toward, is that those two things are not mutually exclusive. We'll see you in the next one. Stay safe.